Want to thank all of you for joining us today. My name is Doug Wilson. I am the founder and principal of Alexander Wilson Consulting, and I also work with Rural Voices USA. I want to thank you all for being here with us on a Thursday at noon to discuss a topic that is that's a very big topic, not just for our state, but for across the country, which is broadband technology. And as you know from the pandemic, that has been a huge and vital resource that we all needed over the past 2 years. With that, I will turn over today's town hall to our moderator, Ms. Helen Probus-Mills. Helen.
Thank you so much, Doug. Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad you've joined us for this important conversation. We're thrilled to have with us a representative from the White House, representative from Governor Cooper, and also some of our state legislators, and most importantly, educators and individuals in the industry. So thank you all panelists for joining us today. We're looking forward to a really robust discussion on an incredibly important issue that impacts every aspect of our day-to-day lives. I'm Helen Probus-Mills. I'm the co-founder of the New Rural Project here in North Carolina, an organization that is dedicated to lifting up the voices of the young rural population that has been marginalized recently in past years. I'm thrilled to be partnering here and working alongside Rural Voices USA, which is doing important work in focusing on issues that impact our rural residents across the country in their day-to-day lives and how to improve individuals' lives as we move forward. We will have a few questions to begin our conversation today so that we can ground ourselves in some knowledge of where we are currently, and then we will open it up to questions from our audience. We do really want to hear what your concerns and issues are to make sure that we can get them addressed and you can come away from this town hall informed. So we will begin this afternoon with Mr. Chris Gibbs, who is the chairman of the board of Rural Voices USA. Chris, if you'd start us off, please.
Thank you, Helen. Good morning and welcome to our Rural Broadband Virtual Town Hall sponsored by Rural Voices USA. I'm Chris Gibbs, president of Rural Voices USA. I'm a farmer from Ohio, raising row crops and cattle. As a matter of fact, we just started having calves last night in the rain. So I'm retired from USDA, retired from local politics, and retired as chair of my local board of elections as well. So on behalf of our board of directors and our steering committee members across 8 states, thank you all for joining, panelists and participants alike. You know, Rural Voices' mission is both concise yet complex. Simply stated, we seek to unify and give a voice to people in support of policies and outcomes that benefit rural America. I like to sum it up even tighter when I say with conviction that it's rural America's turn. Now, we meet our mission by organizing local rural folks into steering committees who are known and trusted voices in their local communities. These folks then lend their most important possession beyond their family, which I believe their most important possession is their name, to advocate, communicate, and hold policymakers accountable for rural issues, including climate change, voting rights, ag policy for sure, renewable energy, rural education, economic development, healthcare, and today's topic, access to broadband. Today, we are beyond pleased and honored to hear directly from the White House how the rollout of the president's bipartisan infrastructure package will improve the lives of rural North Carolinians, as well as the whole of the Tar Heel state. Again, thank you again for your participation. Please engage and don't be bashful. On the farm, I always say, if you're bashful around the dinner table, you're going to go hungry. So let's not go away hungry for information today. Next, I'd like to introduce Lisa Hone, Senior Advisor for Broadband for the Office of Management and Budget at the White House. Lisa?
Thank you so much for having me here today. I am here because President Biden is fully committed to ensuring that all Americans have access to high-speed, reliable, affordable broadband services. And so when we talk about broadband, what we're really just talking about is high-speed internet. And I will use the two interchangeably, although Mitch Landrieu, who's responsible for implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law, feels very strongly we should say high-speed internet, high-speed internet. That's what people understand. But since I've told you all broadband and high-speed internet are the same, you'll excuse me when I use the two interchangeably. I don't need to tell you all either that for far too long, too many Americans have not had access to quality high-speed internet services. And that's particularly true in rural America. And we want to change that. The impact of not having high-speed broadband became crystal clear during the height of the pandemic. You don't need me to tell you that when schools went virtual, there were students who simply disappeared because they had no access to the internet. So they didn't have any way of communicating with their teachers, with their administration, doing their day-to-day schooling, much less doing their schoolwork. Some adults could work from home. Others had jobs that would have allowed them to work from home, but without high-speed internet connections, they couldn't do that. Some people with acute or chronic health conditions could avail themselves of telemedicine, and we saw a sea change in the use of telemedicine during the pandemic. But those without quality internet connections couldn't do that. So, when we talk about broadband, we think about it as having three components. Access. Does the infrastructure exist that allows you to purchase a high-speed internet connection? Affordability. If a high-speed internet connection is available, can you afford to purchase it? And equity. Do you have the tools, devices, and skills you need to be a full participating member of the digital economy? We have to address all three of these components, access, affordability, and equity, to end the digital divide and to make sure that all Americans can be full digital citizens. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation with my fellow panelists. I think you'll hear that echoes of what we all have to say, but we'll all come at it from slightly different perspectives. And so I look forward to hearing what my fellow panelists have to say and getting questions from the audience. Thank you for having me.
Nate, Denny, we'd love to hear from you and have you introduce the perspective from which you sit on this issue.
Sure. Thank you so much. I really I want to echo Lisa and say I really appreciate the chance to talk to you today about the work and the planning that Governor Roy Cooper has put into closing the digital divide in North Carolina. Lisa referenced the components of building digital equity. And Governor Cooper has built, and the General Assembly has appropriated, a comprehensive plan to do just that, right? To make huge investments in infrastructure access, to address affordability, and to build digital literacy, making sure that North Carolinians have the devices and skills they need to fully participate in the modern economy. I think we've got a plan to use more than $1 billion of American Rescue Plan funding to jumpstart this here in North Carolina. And then, of course, we are eagerly awaiting funds from President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law to really close remaining gaps and make sure at the end of the day that every North Carolinian is finally on the right side of that digital divide. So look forward to the discussion and the questions, and again, appreciate the invite. And I believe Senator Murdoch's next up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nate, and thank you for your leadership in this space. We need strong, bold leadership to assist our governor as he works to achieve these goals. And so we are all in this together. I'm thrilled that even though in North Carolina, I serve in the minority, this is one of those bipartisan issues that preceded my time in the General Assembly. And thank goodness we were already really, really working on those plans, even back to some Hometown Strong programs that came out of Governor Cooper's office. Really, really wanted to put an emphasis on expanding broadband. And then here comes COVID. COVID made it really clear that we had to speed up all of our efforts to deal with the digital divide that we've talked about. Want to lift up the story of a young person in Kinston, North Carolina, at the height of COVID, did not have access to internet in his home, and unfortunately gained media attention. He was walking to a local McDonald's in his community so that he would have the internet he needed just to do his homework. So that's what we're talking about. I represent Durham, which is an urban area, but my heart will always be with rural communities. And even in our urban areas, one of our large public housing authorities here in Durham, in Dougal Terrace, we had to do a lot of work to retrofit those buildings so that they also had access to internet. So a lot of our older buildings are still facing those challenges. So it is one of those issues that unites all of us, no matter what community you're in. We still have a long way to go when it comes to building up that internet and broadband access and telehealth. Back to COVID, you were instructed to not go to the emergency room and to your local doctor. So a lot of medical offices were really dependent on that telehealth. And so now, not only will you lose out on education, but critical health care if you don't have access to broadband. And it can be a game changer. Talk with physicians about this all the time, because I serve on a number of healthcare committees. If you are someone working 2 and 3 jobs and you can find time to walk outside or to go to the break room to have that virtual meeting with your doctor, opposed to having to take off of work and physically go into that doctor's office, and through that conversation, they can prescribe you with the medication that you need. Game changer for healthcare. All the more reason that we have to do a better job with this. North Carolina ranks in the top 25, depending on what data source you use. We may be around 15 or 18, but even with that, at least 1.1 million households in North Carolina still lack access to high-speed internet. I want to close by talking with equity. I'm glad that we do have a goal to increase coverage here in North Carolina by 2025 to get those subscriptions up to 80%. But do want to highlight for Native American and Indigenous households, we're only at 57%, Black households only 64, Latinx 68, white at 76. So this can be the great equalizer for our people and for the economy. That is why we have to be laser focused on utilizing our state and federal resources to bridge this digital divide. Next up, we will hear from Representative Terry Brown.
Thank you, Senator Murdoch. I appreciate that. Thank you all, Rural Voices USA and all the panelists for this event today. I cannot overstate and echo what we've already said about the importance of moving our state forward with transformative broadband expansion across North Carolina. I consider myself a little bit of a student of history, and what I think about the transformation that we can make now with North Carolina in broadband expansion is akin to what Governor Kerr Scott did in the 50s, where he paved rural roads, and paving those rural roads gave the people in the eastern and western part of the state of North Carolina access to so many transformative educational, economic opportunities. And broadband expansion right now in North Carolina is at a pivotal moment where we can do those things. Again, I don't want to, I know we're going to get into a lot of these great conversations, but I do want to highlight some of these same things that have already been brought up before. My wife is a mental health counselor, and being able to do virtual sessions with her pediatric clients was so key during the COVID-19 pandemic, because you've got students who are not only going through the normal everyday things you go through as a young person and living in our society, but they're also going through COVID-19 and the scariness and uncertainty around that, and the uncertainty around what their parents are also going through and their caretakers are going through. And being able to have that telehealth option is so crucial. And she sees clients all throughout the state, and there were times where she was unable to see some of her patients because of their lack of access to high-speed internet. North Carolina right now has a lot of access to high-speed internet, but the one thing that we're missing on a disconnect in a lot of ways is being able to connect everyone who needs that access to those data points. So really thinking outside the box on how we're able to use these funds that are coming down from the federal government, working with Governor Cooper's administration and our peers and colleagues of the General Assembly is really pivotal to help move our state forward as we continue to make ourselves a state that's attractive to new businesses, being able to have people who are able to use online learning to get that workforce development training, to be able to have access to our great colleges and community colleges here in North Carolina, to be able to make themselves attractive, even though they're in a rural area where they wouldn't have those opportunities before. So it opens up so many doors to so many folks across the state. And just like connecting those rural roads in the 50s, piping in electricity, water, all these public utilities that we have now that we consider things that are necessities, internet access is a necessity. You know, it's not like it was 20, 30 years ago in the early days of the internet. Right now, having the internet is really the difference between having a great life and not having a great life. We need to make sure these opportunities are available to everyone. So I'm excited to be here and glad to start this conversation with y'all. And I believe next I'll be passing it on to Miss Jazzy Good. Thank y'all.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jazzy Good. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this and to speak on behalf of educators across the state of North Carolina. Like I said before, my name is Jazzy Good. I've been in education for 10 years between South Carolina and North Carolina. And so I'm currently a STEM coordinator at the school that I'm at. I've been in this position for 3 years. And like you all were saying, COVID-19 has definitely brought to light just how important it is for this broadband expansion and high-speed internet for all. Although I live and work in Charlotte, North Carolina, I have family, friends, and teachers that I am close to who work and live in rural areas and have expressed concerns, such as what Senator Natalie Murdock talked about the students having to walk to places like McDonald's and things like that to obtain internet access to receive just a basic need, which is education. And so with that being said, I'm excited to be able to speak on behalf of us as a whole, as far as education is concerned, and be able to shed some light from that perspective and lens.
Thank you so much, Ms. Good. Appreciate your perspective as an educator. We'll now hear from Monica Gibbs, no relation to Chris, and she's going to talk a little bit about rural life and activism in this space. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I do appreciate the work that you all are doing, Rural Voices USA legislators, and on the policy side. As you just said, I am an activist, a community advocate. I run Gibbs Public Affairs, where I take on contracts that work directly with the community. And a lot of the work that I do is linking the community with the issues and giving them the tools to advocate and connecting them with legislators and policymakers and figuring out those solutions on how to fix these things. And broadband, it's been a long time coming. I'm from Eastern North Carolina. And if you know North Carolina, there are about 20 plus Eastern very rural counties that border the coastline that span from the top of Virginia out to the Outer Banks down to just below Wilmington. And I've worked in almost all of those communities and hearing these stories. And I'm out there in the trenches and I get the questions on the why, the how, the when. You know, how do we access these things? And so I'm happy to be here today, excited about this conversation. A lot of the issues that we have in the community are all broadband is at the core of everything, because as Senator Murdock was talking about, just almost everything we do, from healthcare now to education to just getting basic knowledge is we're depending on this broadband. And a lot of us may take it for granted, but this is a very real thing. And if you're out here in the communities and hearing the stories and seeing people who really on a daily basis just do not have access, this is what the conversation that I would love to be a part of. And I'm just happy to be here and hopefully be able to share later on some knowledge that I bring as well.
Thank you so much, Monica. You make a very good point. The how, the why, and the when. That is exactly why we're here and what we'll be discussing. So thank you. Thank you, panelists. We'll now start with some questions, some of which we've previously received, and dig into this a little bit more. Lisa, if we could start with you, if you don't mind, please. One of the biggest aspects of this is funding. If you could talk a little bit about how the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has benefited North Carolina and will benefit North Carolina in regard to rural broadband.
Sure, I'd be happy to, although it can take a while because there are so many ways. So I'm going to focus. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So I will refer to it as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It has about $65 billion in investments in broadband across those three components that I mentioned: affordability, access, and equity. And so I'm going to try and hit the highlights and let you know how North Carolinians can get plugged into that funding. The first, and it's first because it's most immediate, it created the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is the successor to the Emergency Broadband Benefits Program, if any of you heard about that. So the Affordable Connectivity Program provides a subsidy of up to $30 a month for lower income households for internet services of their choice. And already almost 450,000 North Carolinians are getting this benefit, but there are many, many more households that are eligible. So I encourage you all to look into the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP for short, and help people you know who are eligible for the program sign up. Eligibility is based on household income, so it's a benefit to the household, one per household. A household qualifies if the household income is at or below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. So to give you a sense of what that is for a family of four, that's about $55,000. And it goes up and down depending on the number of people in your household. But you don't have to qualify under that income threshold. You can also qualify if at least one member of your household receives another federal benefit. And specifically, if at least one member of your household is receiving benefits from SNAP, from WIC, from Medicaid, if one of the members of your household is eligible to participate in national free and reduced school lunch programs. And there's a host of other programs, but those are the main ways that people qualify. And it's a terrific benefit that lots of North Carolinians are already getting, but we want everybody who's eligible to have access to that benefit. So there's about, as I mentioned, about almost 450,000 households in North Carolina signed up as of April 18th. So in the last 3 days, maybe we've made it to 450,000. And that's out of 11.5 million American households who are already benefiting from that program. So please sign up if you're eligible, tell your friends and neighbors about it. The bipartisan infrastructure law also created a $42.45 billion broadband equity access and deployment program. We call that the BEAD program. It's administered by NTIA at the Department of Commerce. That money will be allocated essentially to states based on the number of unserved locations in each state. Each state gets a minimum of $100 million, I should say, to start, including $5 million planning grants to come up with a state broadband plan. But then above the $100 million, it will be allocated based on unserved locations. And unserved locations is a technical term. And right now what it means is locations in your state, houses and small businesses that don't have access to internet services at speeds of at least 25 megabits download and 3 megabits upload. And I can tell you, Nate Denny lives and breathes this question of who in the state has access to what speeds and for what prices. But this funding will flow to the state broadband office, and they can use it for deployment to unserved and underserved locations and to community anchor institutions for affordability, to get Wi-Fi to multifamily housing units. So there's a fair amount of flexibility to this funding, but we will not see it come out for a while because it is pegged to some FCC, some Federal Communication Commission maps that have not yet been created, which are going to actually tell us for the first time ever what services are available at every single location in the United States. That is a huge change, but it will allow policymakers to set policy around real information, and it'll allow people like Nate and his team who have to implement and get that broadband out there to really know how to prioritize where to get broadband. So it's exciting, but that funding will be a while. It also provides another $2 billion for an existing program, the Reconnect program at USDA, which provides broadband deployment for very rural areas. And that funding can flow more quickly. So it will be part of solving the access problem. And another $2 billion for our tribal connectivity program, which is administered by NTIA, Department of Commerce. In addition, for the first time ever, the federal government has put enormous amounts of money into digital equity and inclusion. So there's $2.75 billion going to digital equity and inclusion grants. The first tranche of that are state planning grants. Congress wants every state to come up with a state digital equity plan, which we think should be incorporated into the broader state broadband plan. But starting really probably in about a month, states will be able to apply for those first state digital equity planning grants. And from there will be capacity grants, much larger capacity grants, and much larger competitive grants for organizations that want to be helping engage in digital equity. Now, as we mentioned before everybody got on, but we talked about this as panelists, this is not all the federal funding. This is the latest tranche of federal funding. Even before that $42.45 billion in BEAD program funding is available, there's lots of money available to states and to localities for broadband deployment. And the state of North Carolina is making good use of that money. I don't know why I said funny, excuse me, please, that money. So the American Rescue Plan provides $350 billion to states states and localities for a whole variety of uses. The broadband deployment is one of them. And as Nate mentioned, the state of North Carolina is committed to using, I think, $1 billion of ARP funds for broadband deployment across the state, which is going to make a huge difference to the number of people in North Carolina who are connected. There's also, as part of the American Rescue Plan, something called the Capital Projects Program. This is administered by Treasury, and the state of North Carolina has is entitled to more than $200 million from that program, and broadband deployment is a preferred use there. So we expect to see a whole lot of broadband deployment occurring across the country using existing federal funds like the ARP funds, and then moving into the broadband equity access and deployment funds. I think North Carolina is very well positioned to make sure that all North Carolinians are served by the time we get through all this deployment. And you have a really excellent state broadband office, which means you have sort of a huge advantage going forward in terms of getting this done. Now, I should say I am biased because I married into North Carolina, if you will. My husband is from North Carolina, and my husband's family is still in North Carolina. So I am excited to see how this changes the accessibility, the affordability, and the equity when it comes to internet services for North Carolinians.
Thank you, Lisa. That was very informative. Nate, maybe if you could answer the question, but in the context of one of the questions that's coming in the chat, which is how will counties be able to access these funds?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. A couple of things that I want to quickly touch on that Lisa mentioned. One, I'm glad this is recorded because she said that Digital Equity Act funding should be available in about a month. So I'm glad we've captured that commitment here from the president's team. So the second thing I want to say is Lisa mentioned the Affordable Connectivity Program, and I can't have enough opportunities to say acpbenefit.org in this call, because the audience that your team has gathered here needs to go back into their communities and help us get more North Carolina enrollees. Governor Cooper proposed to use $420 million of American Rescue Plan funds to further subsidize the cost of high-speed internet for low-income North Carolinians. And that is not a part of our proposal that made it through the budget negotiations in the long session through the General Assembly, unfortunately. So we're having to put all of our eggs and affordability in an ACP basket, right? We're going to do everything in our power to drive up enrollment in the Affordable Connectivity Program for as many North Carolinians as are eligible. And so my ask every time I get on a Zoom call, every time I'm in an in-person meeting or have an audience of any size or type is help us get that message out into your communities, help us drive up that rate. And I will make sure that this group has my contact information. If anyone in your audience is interested in helping us with that, we need that help very badly. So I want to say that quickly. As Lisa mentioned, and as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, Governor Cooper has built a proposal to build digital equity in North Carolina using American Rescue Plan funds, that State Fiscal Local Recovery Fund and Coronavirus Capital Project Fund, which Lisa mentioned. The General Assembly appropriated more than $1 billion to that purpose, right? So, we are going to use the entirety of North Carolina's $273 million capital project fund allocation for broadband, right? We're going all in. North Carolina got $5.5 billion in state fiscal recovery funds, and we're using more than $1 billion of it for this purpose, right? So what we've done is set up a range of different programs intended to get infrastructure investment in communities. And I'm going to talk a little bit here about infrastructure, but I don't want to lose track of the affordability piece, the devices, the skills, because I can run fiber through your front yard, but if you can't afford it, or you don't have a laptop or even a smartphone in your house, or don't have the skills to use high-speed internet safely and navigate cybersecurity and privacy risks, you still risk being left behind in the modern economy. But to start with the infrastructure piece, we've got $970 million in American Rescue Plan funds going to several different infrastructure programs. First, the state has a program that has put out about $15 million a year over the last 4 years called the Great Grants. It's a incentive program for internet service providers to come apply for funds to address unserved parts of the state. And that unserved, Lisa's definition, these are parts of the state that don't have at least 25 megabits per second download speeds and 3 megabits per second upload speeds. Like I said, we've put about 15 million a year out. That program now has $350 million open to internet providers. Applications for those funds are due May 4th, right? So many internet providers are working directly with counties across the state to identify unserved areas and build partnerships, because that program includes a bonus point for counties that contribute part of their local government fiscal recovery funds to a project. Again, if anyone here is in the audience is representing a local government, I'm happy to talk in more detail offline about what those partnerships look like. I'll say, though, that Great Grant program is pretty prescriptive in statute, right? An internet provider comes to us, says we want to cover, say, these 1,000 households. We score it on like 12 different criteria. We spit out a score and we say, congratulations, internet provider. You scored 22. That gets you a 40% match. Go forth and do good work. And you got 2 years to do it. That's good. And that's delivered high-speed internet to a lot of North Carolina households. But it also doesn't allow the state to be as strategic and proactive as we need if we're going to fix this problem. We need local governments, we need county governments to be invested here in targeting the right areas, because they've got the data, right, about who has it and who doesn't. They know their communities. That's where leadership is happening on this issue. So we've created a new program called the Completing Access to Broadband, and it's got $400 million in state fiscal recovery money there. With that program, we will work directly with the county government to jointly identify unserved and underserved parts of the county. Let the county bring some of their fiscal recovery funds to the table, match them up with state funds, and we're going to put out an RFP, right? And we're just going to go directly to the market and say, here are our needs. We need you to make sure that you've got affordable service offerings and that you are participating in the Affordable Connectivity Program. We need you to address these anchor institutions or other local infrastructure needs. We need you to be actively participating in and hiring from the community where you're doing the work. And the good thing about an RFP process, instead of a really prescriptive grant program that has 12 different scoring criteria, is an RFP, a request for proposals in a competitive bidding context, results in a negotiation, right? So then the county and the state and the internet provider are sitting down together and figure out how to make a project work. We're extremely excited about that program. I think we need to see the great grant applications come in and see how high demand is and how effectively we're going to be able to use that 350 million, and then go back and work directly with the counties to target remaining areas. I should also point out that the American Rescue Plan Fund proposal from the governor and what's been appropriated by the General Assembly includes $1 million for us to build a more granular map of who's unserved, underserved, or served here in North Carolina. Lisa mentioned that the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act funds, will get to us after the FCC updates its maps. That's great, and we're glad the FCC is updating its maps because they look at the census block right now. And if a single household has high-speed internet access in that census block, they say the whole census block is served. The result being that North Carolina, if you look at FCC data, has like a 95.5% rate of access to high-speed internet. We know that's dramatically overstated here. We're not waiting for the FCC. We're going to build location-based, specific, household-level maps and have already started that process here in North Carolina so that we can make more targeted investments. I'll also quickly mention, because again, I don't want us to just talk about infrastructure, that we got $50 million over the next 4 years to build digital equity, right? So raising awareness of the Affordable Connectivity Program, getting devices into low-income North Carolina households, helping invest in community-driven digital literacy programs like the great Institute for Emerging Issues Band in C grant program that helps counties with their digital literacy planning efforts. We're going to make huge investments there. Governor Cooper created a new division of broadband and digital equity in our Department of Information Technology, part of his cabinet. And we've got the nation's first Office of Digital Equity and Literacy that we'll be announcing a new director for in the coming weeks, who will be charged with making sure that we're working directly with communities on how to address the high cost problem, how to get devices and investments out into local communities. And that's critical because all the Infrastructure Act money's coming, right? We need to be not creating top-down strategies to fix this problem. We need to be investing in local solutions and really building a digital equity ecosystem so that communities across North Carolina, nonprofits, schools, municipal governments are all well positioned to be as competitive as possible for those Digital Equity Act funds that Lisa referenced earlier. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think we've really got a once in a lifetime opportunity between Governor Cooper's American Rescue Plan commitment and the Biden administration's infrastructure funds to really address this problem once and for all in North Carolina.
Thank you so much, Nate. We really appreciate that. Would anyone like to add anything else to this question from their perspective? Okay, we will carry on then. One of the things that you talked about, Nate, is very much making sure that you're working with the counties. And we know that that's very important to ensure that it's from a bottom up and not a top down. We've had some questions in the chat about the reliability of the data in terms of looking at underserved communities. Monica, maybe you could address that a little bit for us from your perspective, serving the counties that you work in, please.
And so I always talk about the use of data and how reliable it is. And I've just been reiterating in communities everywhere I go that we cannot leave it up to the government and to these agencies and entities to do all this work and do all this reporting. There's a lot of us out on the ground that know where the people are. And I think Nate spoke to finding enrollees. Like if you need some help with that, Nate, I got a long list of people for every issue you can think of in rural communities that can be added to the list. And so I'm always advocating and trying to give people the tools to just that stakeholders and community advocates, and then most importantly, the people that are living these issues that are the most important piece in speaking for themselves and sharing their stories. Stories are really impactful. And I know we talk about policies and legislation and all this infrastructure and all these terms. And I think Ms. Lisa said earlier, we're really talking about high-speed internet, which is what they really understand, but to be able to make it personal and relatable, and then to include people. I don't think that this work and this infrastructure and the build out and the expansion of any of this should be done just relying on government entities, that we need to include the people. And I do believe there's a way to do that. I read through the plan, and in North Carolina, I would love to help be a part of that part that includes, I'm very much, if you hear me speaking about community, grassroots and people, because that is where I believe a lot of the power lies in what we talked about earlier, the what, why, and the when. So.
And also wanted to chime in quickly, since we do have an educator on, and thank you so much, Monica, about the grassroots piece. And it is so much more than infrastructure. Here in Durham, I became aware of a nonprofit, and they were assisting not only parents, but talk about the multi-generational dynamics that are going on in households across America. But here in North Carolina, you have grandparents raising 5 and 6 year olds. So you go virtual and they tell this grandparent, might be 74, you got to go on Blackboard and keep up with grades and all these terms that they didn't have a clue what they were talking about. And my favorite story of that with this nonprofit here in Durham was the grandmother who kept calling and no one was picking up the phone because everyone's remote. And the nonprofit walked her through how to use Blackboard, how to email the teacher. And back to why you need this digital access, she has never had this level of communication with any instructor for her grandchildren. And they actually have done better in school as a result of fixing that connection between having in this instance, the grandparent guardian to really advocate for them in the classroom. But if you don't have those additional programs to say, okay, now you get the technology, but how do you use it? Same for telehealth. So did want to add, we look forward to providing those wraparound services so that folks can truly utilize these new digital tools once they become available.
Thank you, Senator Murdoch. You raise a very good issue, which is we may have them, but people may not know how to use them. Maybe Ms. Good, you could speak to that a little bit from your perspective as an educator.
Yeah, I would definitely say like that's the biggest issue that exists. So like once, of course, this whole like rollout of broadband happens, it's the education piece that's going to be extremely important across the board. You have people who haven't had broadband internet for how long? And so now you're giving them access, which is awesome. But the other part of that is the education piece that exists. And that's where equity comes in. You have people who've been using it forever, like people here in Charlotte, because we have it. But then you have people in Eastern North Carolina who may not have, but y'all also have to make sure that you're providing that education piece to, like you said, like grandparents and even the school system. Some teachers don't necessarily know how to use certain tools on the internet to be able to better educate their students. And so I think that the education piece behind it is going to be extremely important. One of my favorite tools, Common Sense Education, if you've ever heard of it, does a really great job of teaching like digital literacy and digital citizenship. And I think that it's extremely important that like those online resources that exist, once of course broadband is up, get utilized in spaces and places like that to be able to help with some of those skill sets. So.
Thank you so much, Ms. Good. And maybe you could take a moment and speak to the learning loss that occurred during the pandemic. We hear quite a bit about that. What do you see in your work in that regard?
Across the board, whether you've had digital broadband or have not, every student, no matter how gifted or not gifted or IEP or 504 or not, has lost at least 2 years of learning. And that's just the reality. I think that as educators, it takes a lot to embrace that, but it also comes like state. You can't still expect students to take certain statewide testing with the loss. I think that there needs to be like a revamp in that, but just also thinking about how, like you said, like some students didn't have access to school for 2 years. So that 2 years gets multiplied by another 2 because I wasn't even on. And so now that's like 4 years of loss. So it's just thinking about how we have to revamp what we do in our schools, especially in rural areas who have not had the broadband and who didn't see as many students as some places, thinking about how we're going to close that gap, or not even just close the gap, but rethink how we do education, period. So.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Good. Representative Brown, maybe you could speak to a little bit of that issue of the learning loss from the legislator's perspective. How are we going to ensure that the funding is in place to help the children and the teachers get back to where they need to be?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we've been addressing. I actually was meeting with some education professionals here in Charlotte earlier today, and really thinking about how we're going to address the chart forward. And I think one of the things we've had to reassess, not just with education, but with so many different aspects of our day-to-day lives, are what was working pre-COVID is not necessarily going to work post-COVID. And I think that as stressful, as much of a struggle as the COVID-19 pandemic has been, there are things that we have learned from it. And one of those things, to Senator Murdoch's point, was the fact that now we've learned that it is possible to communicate with our educators directly and get that feedback instantaneously, or quicker than we would have before, have that open line of dialogue before. So I think one of the big things that we're going to have to tackle as a General Assembly is we need to assess what went right during what actually was an improvement during COVID-19, because there's so many times we're focused on this was bad. We had this learning loss. We had all these things that went wrong for these past 2 years, which is accurate. A lot of things did go wrong for these past 2 years, and I applaud all of our educators for working with our students during this time. But there are learning lessons that we can take away, and we don't need to write off these past 2 years going into 3 years wholesale. We can take these tools and say, what we were doing pre-COVID might not have been the most effective thing we were doing. How can we make this more effective, knowing what we know now? And that's incumbent on us as legislators to think outside the box in terms of how we're providing appropriations, and not just providing appropriations the same way we've done it, and actually making sure that we're listening to our educators and listening to those who are in those lived-in experiences on a daily basis. And I think that's something that we're getting better at. Something that we want to make sure we're doing is a lot of times in Raleigh, state government is in a bubble, and we're not actually listening to the folks in the eastern and the western part of the state, the people who are actually doing those lived-in experiences. I tell folks all the time, I'm a lawyer. I ran for office because I was passionate about a lot of issues that were affecting our state, and I think I know what I'm doing as a good job, but I'm not a teacher. So I don't have that lived experience. So I can think all day about what I think is a good idea for education, but the people in the classrooms every day know better than I do. So really pairing that together and making sure that we're thinking about how we're going to address those things. And to really focus on the 2 points that have been brought up so much today, it really comes down to 2 things. It's access and it's training. So making sure that we're not only providing the overall access to give folks the ability to do things, but we're actually training them on how we can make sure we're utilizing these new technologies, how they can implement these new technologies in their homes, in their classrooms, to be so effective. Because, we can give you 100 megabytes upload, 100 megabytes download, but if you don't have a laptop or a Chromebook or some way to connect it to the internet, it's worthless. If you don't know where to go on the internet or how to use these tools, it's worthless. So we need to make sure that when we're making these big investments into infrastructure, we're pairing it with training so that people can really be influential on what they're doing and be impactful on what they're doing, because that'll open up so many more doors. You can always take that training with you from profession to profession as you matriculate from kindergarten all the way through high school. It'll make you so much more beneficial in the long run.
Thank you so much, Representative Brown. Nate, maybe you could speak to that issue of digital literacy. In the allocations being made by the state government, there must be programmatic things that are being put in place, perhaps through the community colleges and others. Do you have a little information in that area, please?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of folks trying to address this need. I can speak to certainly the Department of Information Technology and our broadband divisions work. Part of that $50 million over 4 years for digital literacy programming is designed specifically for that, right? Building training opportunities and curricula. I think where we see it a lot at the state's Department of Information Technology is North Carolina has a critical shortage of technology workers, right? And particularly cybersecurity experts. those that we do have in the state, and that's a shortage across public and private sector, right? Those that we do have may have an option to come work for us, but they also may have an option to go work for SAS or Cisco or any of the other IBM, all the companies that are here in the Research Triangle Park. I think the digital literacy and skills training we're talking about here is hugely important for North Carolina's competitiveness as a state, our workforce development. We've got, I think, 11 now NSA certified centers of excellence for cybersecurity at North Carolina's community colleges and universities that are helping to train that workforce. Community colleges are an absolutely essential part of delivering that value and developing that set of skills across North Carolina's student population. So we will continue to try to invest in more. And again, I think that'll be a primary use for the Digital Equity Act funds that both the state of North Carolina get to help build digital literacy capacity across the state, and those that other entities are eligible to seek through the competitive grant program as well.
Great.
Well, and if I could,
Yes,
Helen, one thing I'm hearing, but I think it's worth pointing out, is digital literacy is a continuum and it is not one and done, right? And so digital literacy is everything from folks just feeling comfortable turning on the computer and using the browser to do a search, to becoming experts in cybersecurity. And I will certainly speak for myself when I say I am old enough that I have seen radical change over the course of the last several decades over what it meant to be able to use a computer. I confess 3 iPhones because I have a personal one and I have 2 job ones. I don't know how to use 95% of what those iPhones could do, right? And I don't think I know anybody who does, maybe some random 17-year-old, but my point only is that not only is this a lifelong learning thing, it's also a question of getting people being comfortable to figure out things on their own and teach other people. So digital literacy isn't just one thing. It is a continuum of things that's important to everybody and has become so integral to our lives that we need to find ways to get people to the place they need to be today, but also to get them to a place where they're comfortable knowing that they're going to learn more things all the time. And every year is going to look different in terms of their knowledge base.
Thank you for that, Lisa. I am with you on my skill set. Doug, I believe you have a question from the audience that we will raise now for the panel.
Yes, and this is from David Glenn. I know David had to hop off for another meeting, but David is with the St. John's Episcopal Church, Wake Forest, and the North Carolina Council of Churches. And his question is, what approach are you planning? What approach are you going to use in the implementation efforts to ensure that rural North Carolina, from Murphy to Manteo, will benefit from the expansion of broadband rather than urban North Carolina receiving a disproportionate amount of the funding? So I think that may be a state government question. I think it may go to Nate and then maybe Senator Murdoch, Representative Brown as well.
Sure. I think the starting point is that all of these funds for infrastructure are going to prioritize unserved areas, right? Now, I don't want to paint unserved areas as purely a rural problem, right? Because we have parts of Southeast Raleigh, parts of Durham, parts of Charlotte that struggle for access to the infrastructure and where it's hard to get decent, reliable, high-speed service. But given the level of funding between the American Rescue Plan and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the way that North Carolina's grant programs and competitive bidding programs are designed, and the way that the federal government's, particularly through the new BEAD program, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment. And again, we talk about really once in a lifetime levels of funding. That is a $42 billion pot of funds that will be driven. And this is the best thing that the Biden administration and Congress did. Unlike many other federal investments in high-speed internet, they made the strategic decision to go through the states, right? And so that $42 billion pot, North Carolina will get a formula share of it. It prioritizes unserved areas. And I think that in itself is going to help us make sure that these investments are available and beneficial across our state and not concentrated just in urban areas. And I think that's true across the Digital Equity Act funding too, right? I think we actually started in North Carolina with an exclusion. Our grant funding was only available in what are called Tier 1 economically distressed counties. So the 20 poorest counties in the state. We've really worked hard to open that up, and finally our grant funds are available statewide for this purpose. But we also have other protections in place, right? We have, I think, in our Great Grant Program, a $4 million cap on awards in a given county, right? So we're going to make sure the funds are received and proportionally, and that rural communities across the state have access to those funds.
Yeah, we thank him so much for that question. Because just to summarize again, with the IIJA funds, $1 million in block funding, along with the state's share of both $4 billion in funding for high cost areas and $37 billion for last mile infrastructure. So I think we've stated it a few times, but to really overstate it, it can be really expensive to serve some of our most rural areas, simply because things are more spread out. As someone that worked in the western part of the state for 5 years, so our very rural counties where things are very spread out, we would have that issue in the transportation sector as well, of how do we get to all these households. So the funding does account for that, of particularly when we're talking about fiber. That's the difficult part, is how do you deal with that last mile? So those shares will be prioritized based on underserved areas, as well as community anchor institutions such as your schools, your libraries, medical, healthcare providers, public safety entities, community colleges, as well as institutions for higher education. So not only will we prioritize rural areas, we will also look at those urban centers. And back to what the Deputy Secretary was mentioning in regards to the maps. The maps will also help to make sure we aren't simply focusing on urban areas. Again, here in Durham, if you go to northern parts of our county, the internet service is terrible. So the mapping will help us to say, yes, this by census definition may be urban, but if there is a dead spot in this census tract, let's do something about that. But let's also not leave behind the far east and the far western parts of our state.
Okay, great.
And yeah, not to continue to belabor the point, I think that Nate and Senator Murdoch did a great job kind of summarizing what's going on there. But the biggest thing that we're actually focusing on, what we're targeting for these funds, is looking at those areas where we know there is a need for access. And as we've alluded to before, we've got access. There's access, quote unquote access, pretty much in 98% of the state right now. But when you're thinking about who actually needs it, there's only about 46% of our state have access to what is considered low cost, affordable broadband access. And we're looking at the rubric and the numbers that have been provided by the Jobs Act and previous to that, the ARP funds that we've gotten in. One of the things the General Assembly has been very diligent in looking at is looking at where we need this access, where it can be best deployed at. And with that, as we've already discussed, updating our map so we actually have the best data to know where we can send people in at, to make sure that we're being the most effective and having the most impact on the funds that we have. Because, $1 billion is a huge investment, but as anybody who's worked in government will tell you, $1 billion can get gone in the blink of an eye very quickly. It doesn't go very far, surprisingly enough. So we want to make sure we're being very judicious and being very strategic with how we're deploying those funds.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your answers on that question. We have a question in the chat from one in our audience talking about making sure, as Monica's raised up, that the community voice is really heard. She describes living in a rural community with internet access provided by a phone company. She pays for broadband at a greater rate than is available. And then the phone company explains it's because her connection is too far from the pole. Her DirecTV is provided by another telephone company that cannot provide internet services, and her download and upload speeds fall into the service challenge categories mentioned. So that is really the true experience of our rural residents in North Carolina. One of the things that's also raised in the chat is the question about the 2011, I believe, law that put in place a little bit of a monopoly for some broadband companies in terms of which areas could use which broadband. Would that be something, Senator Murdoch, you could speak to for a moment?
That is a difficult subject. But what I will say is we will continue to work with all of our partners. There are a lot of entities that are already providing the service. And actually with the just learned, fiber is obviously what a lot of folks want. But when it comes to wireless services, I believe Dish actually will be the big provider with that. Then they have a connection with DirecTV. So they're actually pitching a way to say, with some of that last mile coverage, how can you do that through cloud-based services opposed to that? But yes, various municipalities, including ones that I serve, they would like to do more. So I think that's something that we will always look to. And I think, you know, everything does have to be on the table, but there are definitely industries that are out there making their case, saying that they do believe that they can do that the best. So a long way to go with that from a legislative perspective, but know that we just want to make sure whoever gets those awards to do the contracts, that they do them the best way that they actually can be done. But Lisa, I see that your hand is raised as well.
Yeah, I can't speak to the North Carolina law, but I will say this about federal funding. We strongly believe that fiber is the gold standard. It is as close as you get to future-proof, and it is what and it has a high priority in both ARPA funds and in the BEAD funds. So our expectation is that most of those funds will be spent on fiber deployment. And that means that for the next 3 decades, the households and businesses that get access to that fiber will have faster and faster speeds. And one thing I should point out, Nate might know this because I haven't looked at it in a few years, but close to 100% of the K through 12 schools in North Carolina, if not all of them, have fiber to the schools. And that was a game changer for the schools. But obviously the pandemic showed us that it's not enough to have fiber to the schools. You need to have fiber to the homes as well. And so we place a high priority on getting fiber wherever it is topographically and economically feasible. That's not every single location in the United States, but it is the vast majority of locations. And what's been striking over the last even just 5 years is all the places that fiber has been laid that in the past people would have said, that's too expensive, that's too hard. So just want to put that flag out for fiber wherever possible.
Well, I'd like to weigh in on several pieces there. One, Lisa makes a great point, and I think a commenter said this as well. You know, North Carolina benefits from the foresight of Governor Jim Hunt and others who created this incredible asset in MCNC, which provides a lot of the state's middle mile network and is responsible for connecting all of the state's K through 12 schools and nearly all of the state's community colleges and other institutions of higher education. One of the NTIA programs will be $1 billion competitive grant program for middle mile. And while North Carolina has middle mile needs, we've definitely got gaps in coverage. We really have a competitive advantage relative to many states, given those investments that have happened before. So that's one point. Second, on fiber. As Lisa suggested, the vast majority of our investments using federal funds because of Treasury guidance, and Lisa has heard me push back a little bit on this before, but because of the speed requirements and the scalable up to 100 megabits per second symmetrical service, most of these investments are going to be fiber. Now, Governor Cooper's plan, I think, acknowledges that fiber won't be immediately practical everywhere. There are going to be parts of the state that we can't immediately reach, or where fiber's too expensive to deploy immediately. And so we've created a stopgap solutions pot of funding, $90 million, that will allow us to address a range of possible projects and let us invest in potential construction of a tower that can host fixed wireless equipment, potentially pay for particularly high cost segments of fiber that might also otherwise tank the competitiveness of a grant application or a bid, and a number of other uses like downtown Wi-Fi or other projects. So we've built that flexibility using a combination of coronavirus capital project fund flexibilities and state funding options. We've got $30 million that have been appropriated using state capital infrastructure fund dollars that can also be leveraged where some of the ARPA considerations are somewhat limited. The last point I'll make, I think one of the questions there that Helen referenced was about the level playing field bill from the last decade. And that was the one that restricted new municipally owned networks from being financed or created or leveraged in North Carolina. Now we've got a few pre-existing networks. I know Greenlight in Wilson, North Carolina is an example that gets a lot of attention, that's really transformed that community. We've got a few entities out there that existed before that legislation went in. Up to this point, they haven't been eligible to participate in the state's funding programs. One of the important things about the infrastructure money coming to North Carolina is that it prohibits states from excluding those providers. And so I think there will be opportunities there for some of those providers to do more than they do now. The other thing I'll point out is that Governor Cooper has advocated over the last few years repeatedly for more flexibility for municipal and county governments to enter into public-private partnerships, to work directly with providers and finance the deployment of infrastructure that then a private provider can operate in areas where the market hasn't responded. I think the benefit of the level of funding we've got right now and our new CAB program, the one where we'll partner with a county to do an RFP, I think we're going to be able to address areas that haven't been served to this point and hopefully take some of the steam out of that particular political battle.
And Helen, it occurred to me, there was a point one of your commenters made that I hadn't responded to, but I wanted to mention, which is the question was, how will local communities' needs be met, or how will local communities be engaged in this process? Nate spoke to it in terms of the county program, state county program that North Carolina has. But I want to be clear that the bipartisan infrastructure law is very clear that with respect to deployment, with respect to equity, the states are expected to consult extensively with local and county community groups to identify what their needs are and to figure out how best to meet their needs. So it is written into the federal statute when it comes to the BEAD program, BEAD funding, and the NTIA guidance will be crystal clear that there is an expectation of lots of consultation, which, let's face it, is easier in smaller states than it is in larger ones, right? But I think your state team is up to the challenge.
Thank you, Lisa. And one additional follow-on for that question in the chat is, will labor have a role in the allocation of these funds?
I'm definitely going to request it. I actually had a call with CWA actually just this week. So I'll be going directly to the governor's office on that to say, they definitely do want to have a seat at the table. And Chris, I believe earlier you said that you have a background in farming. So I did just see a question that was actually in my head that people forget the need for broadband access impacts agriculture. A lot of these fancy combines are computers. And if you do not have internet access, good luck taking advantage of the best of this equipment that is highly efficient, that really, really helps you to maximize all of your acreage. And it's very, very hard to do that without any internet. So for all of our folks in agriculture and our farmers, they're another huge, huge demographic that we have to include in these conversations, because they will be left behind if they don't get that critical access to broadband that they need as well.
Thank you for mentioning that. As I told folks before we got on, actually, very frankly, I'm lucky that I was able to hang on this long, because I do not have high-speed access. My access is wires, is radio access. And actually, this has been a good day that I could be here. Normally, I can't hold a Zoom out here, and I'm on a state route in Ohio, Western Ohio, and this is not. It's rural, but it's not out in the sticks by any means. But fiber is 1,400 feet down the road, and they won't bring it up to me. But by golly, they're going to bring it up to me now, because we've got the infrastructure bill, and my expectation is I can see it down there, the box, but I just can't get it. So thank you for reminding agriculture.
Thank you, Senator Murdoch. Yes, that's a very important question, certainly here in North Carolina. Nate, one of the aspects of all of this is actually in the implementation. Do we have the people to dig all the trenches? We are suffering from a huge housing boom. No one can get anything repaired these days. Is the state government looking at that at all as the funding comes available? How will we actually implement these projects?
Yeah, it's a major concern. I would say that both labor supply and material supply are a challenge here. We've got, you hear a lot about fiber supply as a challenge, and I'll come back to the labor piece, I promise. But in North Carolina, the big 5 or 6 providers, the major corporate incumbent providers, have the fiber they need to execute. But I'm hearing from rural co-ops that are an absolutely critical part of addressing this challenge in North Carolina, and other small providers, that they're on wait lists for fiber between 55 and 85 weeks, right? And so if my program awards grant funds to a provider that has 2 years to execute, they're waiting to get their materials for 1.5 years. We've got a huge challenge. And where a provider gets in the program, I think the state has tools to help address that challenge. I'm actually much more concerned about the providers that don't have confidence in their ability to execute and don't seek funding in the first place. We're engaging directly with counties and with providers of all sizes and types across North Carolina to assess that risk, both on supply and on labor, and figure out if there are tools that the state can bring to the table. I think Wilson Community College has a really incredible program, a certificate program for fiber infrastructure deployment that they've just announced, that I think is a great benchmark for the rest of the state to follow. But we'll keep working through that challenge. And again, to Lisa's point, that we're not going to be able to succeed without the kind of local, targeted, purposeful local engagement that is required by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, right? And so we're spending a lot of time talking to counties, talking to municipalities, talking to the Association of County Commissioners, the School of Government, the Rural Center, every stakeholder that brings folks together across our state that we can get our hands on to try and build those lines of communication. And again, I will make sure, at the risk of my inbox, that my email address is in the chat here. If anyone in your audience wants to connect or feels that communication is lacking in your community, please get in touch and we'll fix that.
And I will say this, the Department of Commerce, which is responsible for the largest amount of the bipartisan infrastructure law broadband deployment funding, is working closely with manufacturers, particularly of fiber optic cables. Corning, as you probably all know, has expanded its capacity in North Carolina recently, and recognizing the demand is huge. And we are optimistic that that supply will rise to meet demand fairly soon. Although I don't know about the rest, I probably like me, the rest of you. And during Corona times, time is so unclear, right? What happened last week versus last month versus in 2 months. But my point is that the Department of Commerce is aware of the supply issues and working with manufacturers to try and see what we can do to make sure they're ready for the demand to increase even more. The labor supply, we're also very aware of. The infrastructure bill pumps a lot of money, not just into infrastructure, but to really important roads, bridges, water, EV charging. And a lot of the labor needs are the same, right? Or very similar. So the good news is that there is going to be a lot of labor demand for people looking for jobs. The challenge is there's going to be a lot of need for a lot of labor for bridges, water, highways, EV charging, broadband. And so we need to figure out, are there ways to make things work together? We're looking to see what different states are doing because they're all doing interesting things. As Nate mentioned, community colleges are a great source of education for some of these jobs. I can tell you, for example, the state of Louisiana recently put out a grant program that gave extra points to broadband providers who committed to participate in a Louisiana community college training program. And every single provider, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe that every single provider who applied for a grant said that they wanted to participate in that program, which makes sense, right? Because they're the ones who need to find the skilled labor. And so having local community colleges who willing and interested in doing that training is a win-win situation. But different states are handling this differently. But as Nate said, it's something they're thinking about and working on in North Carolina. And we want to be good partners with the states on these issues.
And if I can chime in really briefly too on that, I'm optimistic, like Lisa is as well, that we're going to be out of our supply chain issues here sooner rather than later. And it's impacted everything that we've been doing. But as we come out of that, one of the things I think we should be really focusing on is how we're being innovative and how we're deploying broadband across the state. One of the conversations that our office has had with NCDOT is NCDOT, the STIP program that has all the different projects that NCDOT is working on, has thousands of projects across the state where they are going out, digging up roads and laying down cables, other infrastructure. And one of the things that we're thinking about is, while they're already out there, they're already digging up the sides of the roads, they're already going into neighborhoods and communities. While they're out there, are they able to go ahead and lay some of those fiber optic cables so that even if we're not able today to be able to deploy those that high-speed internet to people who are in these communities, the cables and the groundwork and that infrastructure is already laid, so that when we do have the capabilities to connect those cables, the lines are already down, so we don't have to go out and redo the wheel, because NCDOT is already going out digging up those lines and laying that infrastructure. So those are some of the things that we're really hopeful that we can think through and get implemented, so that we can make sure that we are being as judicious and effective with our tools, our resources, our labor as we can be.
North Carolina's Department of Transportation has been an incredibly effective leader and partner on this issue. I think some folks here may recall Governor Cooper issued Executive Order 91, which required state agencies to work together in a broadband task force focused on removing state government barriers. One of the requirements of that executive order was DIT, the Information Technology Department, and DOT working together on a dig once policy, so that we make sure we notify internet providers anytime roads are open for exactly that purpose. So that is a really critical tool for us as we move forward.
Thank you so much. Monica, I believe you have a comment.
So I just wanted to add on, I know we talked a lot about digital equity and digital literacy, and then also the affordable access that this infrastructure has in place. And I do agree with both of those. And those were two of my favorite parts, like working in rural communities, to hear this affordability part and the digital equity. But one thing I haven't really heard a lot about, and I think Senator Murdoch touched on the farming industry, but the opportunity for rural economic development. So something that I talk about a lot in the communities is being able to increase that. And I think we're at a place with this, where just with broadband expansion alone and the construction, to think about how many new jobs are going to be created. And even with small wireless internet service providers, what this will do for them, and then the attraction of businesses in these areas. And I remember years ago when we had these call centers all over the place that have now gone away because call centers are now in the homes. And so to be able to think about how many people would have the opportunity to access work from home that maybe don't have transportation. And I'm smiling because I think there's endless opportunities here that are going to benefit these rural communities. But the one thing that definitely comes to mind and that's most important to me is the opportunity for rural economic development piece. So yeah.
And I want to piggyback off of that, Monica, like being a
Please.
STEM educator, that makes my heart extremely happy, because now students in rural communities are going to be able to get that STEM education to be able to fill those jobs in the future or create those jobs that don't exist because now they have access. And so that makes me extremely excited to in my little STEM heart. So I just want to say thank you for bringing that part to light as well.
Well, and that is why fiber is so important to these communities. Where we can get it, we need to get it there because it's the equalizer. It means people can do the jobs they love in the places they love, and they don't have to go to the big city in order to get hyper speedy broadband. And that's what we're talking about as we head into 2025, 2030, 2035, right? It's not going to be enough to have good enough broadband. You're going to have speeds that are extraordinary. And so it's part of why we're putting our thumb on the scale for broadband, so people can live where they love and work at what they want to do in those places, in their communities, and grow those communities the way they want them to.
Yes, thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Ms. Good. That's an important component part, is what are the interests of the children we're raising in terms of which aspects of these fields do they want to work in, and how do we foster that? And are we doing a good job in really giving them the tools that they need to pursue what they're interested in? If you'd like to add a little bit more from your perspective as a STEM educator, we'd love to hear it.
So I teach computer science, I teach an app creators course, and I teach a medical detectives class. And I think about a lot of the issues that you all have raised today as we sit on this call. And I think about me having to go teach those classes in places like that and how difficult that will be. I mean, we have our minor issues here and there, but a lot of them are just computer related. But when you think about places who don't have the high speed internet, how difficult might it be to create this? And so I'm a firm believer, if I can't see it, then I can't be it. But how often is it that they see these careers in places like that in order to believe that they can do it, but then also have the access to be able to even begin to do it? So I think about how important it is in terms of when we think about the future and equity and like good education for all students, and how we're able to get that now with what we have coming to North Carolina. So I'm extremely just excited about like what's to come, and just hope that we can get people in places in there. I think about my boyfriend, he's a software engineer, but if we decided to move to Eastern North Carolina, his job would be a job that he wouldn't necessarily be able to do very well in places like that. But we always talk about, we want to keep our families there. We want to keep, our well, they bring back this whole like build back the block and keep the block the way it is. But it's just like, it's really hard to do that whenever the access isn't there. So that's why you have people moving to more urban places like Charlotte or Atlanta or places like that, because the access is there. But can you imagine what it would look like if a kid really just wanted to stay next to his grandma and his mom, but he was able to be a software engineer and create a really good living for himself, but also just stay in that community? So I think about things like that. And so I'm excited for what's to come.
Thank you so much. I think that's very important. Doug?
Yeah, just want to thank everybody on the panel for your time today. I know that we've had a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I think we've been answering a lot of those as we went along. I know we have some questions in here from Mr. Tony Blake about FTTH, about extending physical infrastructure versus wireless. I think we touched on that. I see that Scott Huffman had a question about his business. How can his business access funds to ISPs? So A lot of these questions, I think that we have are very good questions. And I know, Nate, you put your email in the chat. And I think a lot of these questions are, not to kind of pile on Nate here, but I think a lot of these questions are government related questions with the state government. But I know that we said that we will have this town hall from 12 to 1:30. I think we've answered a lot of good questions, a very good dialogue. Thank you, Helen, for being a moderator on this. But I guess, Helen, we can now turn it over to some last comments from our panelists as we close out.
Thank you so much, Doug. We really appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for spending some time with us today. We will finish up here with some final words. Representative Brown, shall we start with you?
Yes, thank you. I've had a great time today. Really enjoyed this panel. It was fantastic to be able to connect with all the folks out there who are listening, that are passionate about these issues that are affecting the rural parts of our state and expanding broadband. I would just like to make sure I'm continuing to be a resource for everyone. While I may not represent everyone that's watching on this Zoom, I would love to be able to connect you with who does represent you and be able to connect you on any of these issues as we continue to fight and make sure that we're taking care of everyone across the state. So I'll leave my contact information in the chat box, but I just wanted to echo all the sentiments today that broadband expansion is a focus of us here in North Carolina. We're doing everything we can to make sure that we are bridging these gaps and make sure that we're giving everyone access to this, because it is not just a internet issue. It is an issue that affects health. It's an issue that affects our economy. It's an issue that affects education. It's an issue that touches on every single facet of our lives here in North Carolina. So making sure that we're giving everyone across the state the opportunity to have access to high-speed internet is crucial. So I want to thank Lisa and the team over at the White House and the Biden administration for all the work they're doing. I want to make sure we're thanking Nate and the team at Governor Cooper's office and all the panelists today and Rural Voices USA for putting this event on. So thank you, and I appreciate working with you all in the future on this.
Thank you, Representative Brown. Senator Murdoch?
Yes, thank you all so much for this robust conversation and been keeping up with the chat. And I'm hearing a lot of folks saying they want this information. You know, they want to hear more. They're excited. They want to learn how they can partner, want to learn more about these grant programs. And that's why we're here. We are so blessed to have all these federal programs, but it's hard for the average person to keep up with all of them. But this is definitely one that's been a long time coming. We've been setting the stage for this in North Carolina years and years ago, when we're finally at a point where we can really start executing and really start making sure that we address the urban-rural divide with broadband leading the way. It is the great equalizer, the same way that education was, digital will. And I think you all just hit on it, Monica. I'm so glad you lifted up just the need for folks to be able to work and live wherever they want to when they cannot do that if they do not have adequate broadband access. So whether it's healthcare or education, whatever the issue is, you are impacted by your ability to have adequate access. And we feel it here in North Carolina. We're a very diverse state. We have a little bit of everything. So we will be one of the states that will be leaning in to address this. I think the federal administration, as well as leadership in the General Assembly and Governor Cooper, that we have rolled up our sleeves to really focus on getting this done. It is the issue of our time. We have to prepare now so that folks are able to compete for jobs and technology that doesn't even exist yet. They'll be even more behind if we don't take that very seriously here at this juncture. And we'll also just end with, how we began, particularly for education, just about our children, lifting up again that young man in Kinston, that had to walk for that access. We have to address this. These are lives and people that we're talking about, not just policies and grants programs. We're talking about the ability to really transform the lives of everyday people that will continue to be left behind if they don't get this access and if we don't get it right. So we look forward to continuing to work on this in the General Assembly. We'll go back to short session May 18th, but we are full steam ahead on this. And again, thank the state, especially Nate Denny, for all the work he's doing, as well as the White House. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Murdoch. Ms. Gibbs?
Oh, I'll bring it back and end it with, again, that we don't have to wait for government entities and agencies to do this work. There are people like myself out here in the communities that are ready and willing to help. I saw some questions in the chat about how can our local community and how can our residents get this ball rolling in our community. I would say, like, advocate in North Carolina, our city councils and our commissioners have a lot of power to move some things along. And it's just going to take some advocating. I love to do that. I'll put myself out there to be able to help with that if anyone needs to. I put my information in the chat, but finding out if your county has ARPA funds and how much do they have, and then also utilizing the data to show what your need is. Data is powerful. And so they talked about using efficient and effective data, but if there's anything that you can use those numbers to show the need and then advocate and pull in other people. We've heard stories and rural communities, it seems like people are scattered, but there's so much power in numbers. And I really believe that communities know best more than anybody what they need. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ms. Gibbs. And Ms. Good, if you'd like to make some closing remarks, please.
Again, thank you all for having me. It's nice to be able to sit in a room full of people who are outside of my agency, who are considering my voice as a voice that's necessary for moving things such as this forward. I would also go on to say I would love to be able to provide access to a teacher who's actually in rural North Carolina. I think that voice is going to be extremely necessary outside of my own. And so if you would like to, I put my email and my Instagram in the chat for you all to be able to reach out in order to get access to that as well. But I'm excited to know that we're having conversations and you all are considering how this does affect education and teachers and the next generation. And so I'm excited to know that we're trying to move things forward in that way.
Thank you so much, Ms. Good. Mr. Denny, if you'd like to have some remarks.
Sure. I want to echo thanks to Rural Voices for hosting this conversation. North Carolina is the second largest rural population of any state in the union, right? So this is a really critical conversation for us. Thanks to our friends and partners in the General Assembly, Monica, for the work you're doing in Eastern North Carolina, where I'm from. Appreciate that. And I think, frankly, most importantly, to Ms. Good for the work she's doing teaching. That thank you. Last things I'll leave here are: one, acpbenefit.org. Go to it, figure out if your internet provider is participating in the Affordable Connectivity Program, check your own eligibility, sign up for it. Most importantly, get that information out to other folks in your community. And then one that we didn't get a chance to talk about is another web address, ncbroadband.gov/survey. And that's where you can go take a speed test that for my team, figure out if you're getting internet services as good as are advertised, and most importantly, help give us data points that we can use as we make some of these investments. We've had internet providers protest our awards because they say certain communities are covered in the state already and we shouldn't be putting money into those communities. And we've been able to point to literally thousands of survey responses in those exact census blocks and communities saying they don't have service, right? So that data is a really essential piece for us. So again, it's ncbroadband.gov/survey. But mainly just want to thank all of you for the conversation today.
Thank you. And Ms. Hone.
Thank you all so much for having me today. We are looking at making a once in a generation change in access, affordability, and equity. And you all are a really important part of this. I appreciate you all spending time doing this. I want to echo Nate's point that ACP benefits are available now. So please, if you're eligible, if you know people who are eligible, send them to acpbenefit.org. If you're a community organizer like Ms. Gibbs, the FCC has great toolkits with lots of information for how to reach out to your communities and let them know about ACP benefit. I don't have a better way to tell you to get to it than just to Google ACP benefit FCC toolkit, but you will find those toolkits with lots of great handouts and other suggestions. But I am very mindful of the irony of having a webinar about broadband because the only people who can participate are people who have good enough access. And as Chris Gibbs pointed out, even when you have okay access, you can never be sure how long you're going to stay online. So I would also like to say, for those folks who are talking to people who can't go to acpbenefit.org, you can have them call this phone number, 877-384-2575. That's 877-384-2575. And they can talk to a person about how to sign up for ACP benefits. Thank you again so much for having me. So you all know, I can't see the chat. So hopefully nobody was directing anything to me in the chat. And it's the reason I didn't put acpbenefit.org or the phone number into the chat. With that, I want to subscribe to the last comments that Ms. Good made about the importance of broadband for everybody, but especially for our students. So thank you all for taking the time today to think about, talk about, and more importantly, taking the time going forward to make a difference in your communities when it comes to high-speed internet access.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hone. And Mr. Gibbs, if you'd like to end our webinar for us,
We
we
will
appreciate
do
you
that. Thank you very
hosting
much.
this. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Helen. Thank you to an all-star cast and all-star panelists. What a great run of show we've had here. Big thank you to our partner on the ground there in North Carolina, Doug Wilson, as well. Want to give our website for Rural Voice, ruralvoices.us. And the final thing that I'll say is that we've had a number of folks ask how they can watch this broadcast, this webinar, hopefully later. That link will be broadcast out to all of the panelists and all of the participants. It will not be proprietary. Send far and wide. Everybody at least has internet as best as we can. So let everybody be able to work with that. And finally, we'll be doing a similar presentation in Pennsylvania for the Pennsylvania State Steering Committee of Rural Voices USA next Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. Thank you.